Good afternoon, everyone. I have an interesting topic just after Gaia to talk about the telecom infrastructure landscape. To start, I'll be a little provocative. I think we've heard a lot, about the 5G vision, which I think remains intact. We'd like to share something more about the first steps to implementation of 5G, share what some of our operator clients are thinking about. And there are two things which are generally spoken in the same breath as 5G. One is industrial applications and the other is small cells. And we're going to challenge both because none of our clients are talking about either at this point in time. So on that bombshell, I'll begin the presentation. So what I'd like to cover today is firstly just about how the towercos have been the leading infrastructure providers for this industry. They've been widening the scope of what they do. I think Gan also shared this, not only the mask, but also power, also remote monitoring services, and so on. But there are new entities that are entering this infraco space. So we'll talk a little bit about what type of other entities are coming into this infrastructure space and why. I think 5G is being talked about as the driver for the next big demand push. That's absolutely correct. I don't think there's any doubt on this issue. And we'll share a little bit about how an MNO is thinking about this from their perspective, from the work we're doing with one of them. And how the network economics plus regulators are likely to push in a direction of more sharing. What will be shared, of course, it will be through already existing MNO agreements. I think there will be some new options, but I think what's interesting is in addition to towercos, there will be potentially new types of entities. It could very well be towercos, but we think there will also be new types of entities, and we'll share real examples of what is happening in the world rather than necessarily from a theoretical perspective. So that's broadly the range of topics for today. So to start with, I think infrastructure and towercos have been used interchangeably now. This is a common expectation that if we're going to do infrastructure, it will be with towercos. What used to be the case is there was a range of in-site services, which would be masts and towers, power, antenna, active equipment, and so on. There's also new kinds of architectures, so there's a cloud RAN, BTS, and there are a whole bunch of services that sit also in terms of remote monitoring. So you can see, there are a selection of towercos, EDOTCOs on the top. One because they're sponsoring the event. The second is because they've done an incredible job. So you can see EDOTCO already does most of the services that traditional infrastructure providers would give today. There are other good examples. China Tower is a very good example. In fact, they've started to reveal their services revenue, which is, I think, a big step in the direction of defining more revenue streams. But we have other examples. There are some, for example, in Indonesia, there's an operator that says, my job is only doing towers and masts and nothing else. I'm really not interested in everything else. So that's the start. Towercos and infrastructure was used in one breath. There is an obvious gap which is around active RAN share, and we talked a lot about this, that perhaps this is going to be the next stage of sharing more active RAN share, backhaul fiber, and so on. So we'll come back to this one. So how do we see the evolution based on what's happening with other entities? So as we say, there's tower and power. This is pretty much a standard package. Of course, tower and power is a very emerging market concept. In developed markets is less power oriented. I just use EDOTCO as an example. There are several others, but EDOTCO is a shining example in this space. Again, now in terms of evolution of infrastructures, there's a few different kinds of infrastructure that's coming. There's a cloud RAN, so you'll centralize some of the equipment. There are small cells and distributed antenna systems. I separate these two because distributed antenna systems are in buildings and so on, and this is a given. I think small cells is the more controversial area, which is more around street furniture and so on, which I will challenge a little bit as we go to the next few slides. And then, of course, services. Again, I just use China Tower as an example because they're publishing this as a number and they reveal how much revenue they're getting from all their services. What's interesting, of course, is in the middle area, which is around antenna. And I specifically pick antenna because one of the biggest jumps in technology when you go from 4G to 5G is actually in antenna technology. And it's not in a way highlighted sufficient because it's not that interesting, but you may hear of MIMO, or massive MIMO, and 8T, 8R, or some such terminology, which are basically an increased functionality coming through the antenna, which of course pumps out a lot more data, but it also is able to direct things in a little bit more sensible way to hotspots and so on. And then of course there's new fiber cores. So there are an emergence of companies that are just focused on building fiber, and this is not existing incumbent MNOs. Of course existing incumbent MNOs do this, but I think the best example of this is there is a company in Cambodia and Myanmar called Hayal Root. They do this fiber core. There is a company called C Squared, which is in Africa. For those who are aware, actually Google has an investment in them. What these companies do is they basically build fiber in the cities. So they build metro rings and they build intercity fiber links. It makes it easier then to connect up a backhaul for sites and so on. Why do such companies emerge? Principally, all of this infrastructure needs investment. If a towerco had unlimited investment, perhaps they might be the ones to do this. But if they don't and they have to focus on their core business and somebody else is able to raise capital, then this comes together. So it's a capital constraint issue. If there is an opportunity, there could be multiple entities who could fulfill it, but some of those entities all entities are capital constrained, so you find new entities emerging. In some of the active sharing, you also find new entities, and I'll talk about this. There is a wholesale network in Mexico. I'll talk a little bit about this. There's a rural active network, and we'll talk about this also in a bit. But you can see that there are different kinds of entities that are saying, hey, I'm in the space for infrastructure in the telecom industry. And I'm not even picking all these new WYSI technologies that, say, Facebook is experimenting with or Google is experimenting with. This is more fulfilling traditional network kinds of services. So now with that, we jump into 5G, and that's just to set the stage for what does the MNO think about 5G. And you all read in the press, there are a lot of 5G rollouts happening globally. I think the most exciting, at least from our perspective, is the fact that China is going to make a big push in the second half in this year, effectively. The question we ask always is, what is the major difference between 5G and 4G? And to answer this question gives us the reason for why an MNO would be interested in 5G. And the answer is not that there's better latency or there's better management of more devices and so on. Fundamentally, the answer for an MNO as to what is the difference between 5G and 4G is that in the 5G world, you've got Chinese handsets. What does this mean? When we launched 4G, the vendors that were very well known were Samsung, Apple, HTC, Sony, and so on and so forth. But in the last few years, what you've seen is a very significant push from companies like Xiaomi, Oppo, Vivo, and these are now constituting a very large proportion of the installed base of devices. Why is this important? This is important because now they are launching 5G devices at price points which are significantly lower than, say, an Apple or a Samsung. So what does that mean? That means if any operator were to launch 5G, it would not be an exclusive service only for exclusive customers, but it is possible it would be a lot more mass market. Is there a business case? Well, the operators that we've been working for, and when they have to pay for something, so they have to pay for spectrum, they need to put a value to everything that they can find. So how much value would they put to institutional applications? At this point, it's zero. The reason being, it's speculative. It doesn't mean they will not try. They will all set in place businesses that are looking to do a vertical application on IoT and so on. But when it comes to saying how much will I value this business when I'm going to buy spectrum, the answer is absolutely zero. So what is the value to this business? It is not a high increased ARPU, because effectively, if you look at all the launches on 5G, it's maybe I'll charge you an extra $10 to access my 5G network, or I'll give you a slightly larger bundle, or I'll give you access to some VR content, but there isn't really much revenue. Therefore, the only reason that they are launching this is because somebody else is launching it. And that is an unfortunate truth in the sense, if my competitor launches it, and there are a lot of different devices available in the market, I better have that proposition as well. If nobody launches it, there will be no 5G, at least not yet from an MNO's perspective, if they had the choice. So what we see is that if any operator, if any regulator makes spectrum available in a market, there will be one of the operators that say, I'm going to go for 5G because I want to protect my customers, or I want to go for a higher value customer of my competitor. And then everybody will have 5G. So therefore, if we don't have money coming out of 5G from an MNO perspective, how do we deploy this network so we're not expending all our capex in a bad way? And to this, I think there is a lot of credit to the vendor community as to how they have engineered 5G. And there are two particular points that I would like to highlight. The first is around the deployment strategy of 5G. The way 5G is being looked at from a deployment perspective is typically when you had a higher frequency, you would say, I've got a higher frequency, it will have poorer coverage. That's the traditional laws of physics. But the way 5G is being deployed, and you would have seen this in this morning in the Korean Telecom presentation, is being deployed as NSA, which stands for non-standalone. All this means is that it is combined with your 4G network. So when the user communicates with a base station, the downlink comes on 5G, but the uplink goes on 4G. What this means is that with a higher frequency, you can get the same coverage. So if you use 3.5 gigahertz or 2.3 gigahertz, you will get the same footprint or a very similar footprint as your 1800 megahertz. So this is a big change in the way the deployment is, and as a result of which, if you look at the deployment strategy of any operator, they are basically putting 5G as an overlay. Of course, they have to pick which are the more urban centers, where will the devices be available, and so on and so forth. And they are deploying this on top of their existing networks. There is no small cell. Will there be small cell? Yes, of course there will be small cells. Because we will reach a point in time where either we run out of capacity, or we decide that we will use this very high frequency called millimeter wave. By the way, millimeter wave, for those aware, it's 26 gigahertz, 28 gigahertz. It's the frequency being used in the US because they don't have anything else at the moment. But all the other operators, including Korea Telecom, I don't know again if someone noticed this, but there was a phase 3 which would have millimeter wave, but it didn't have a date on it. So it would be interesting to see when that is. But effectively, we don't know when this will come. When it will come, yes, potentially there will be a need for such kind of infrastructure. So that's one aspect as to how the costs of deployment in this network are going to be lower than you would have traditionally expected with a higher frequency. The other interesting technology which has been around in the 3G and 4G world but is very mature or is being pushed in a much more standardized way in the 5G world is something called dynamic spectrum sharing, or DSS. What this allows you to do is it allows you to put 5G and 4G in the same spectrum. So just to give you the example, what Swisscom is saying is, and that's just an example because it's public, is they're saying in a year's time we will have 90% 5G coverage. They are not going to have this 5G coverage by putting new frequencies in 90% of the population. The way they're going to get this is by deploying 5G within their existing 4G spectrum bands. There are some limitations to this, but effectively if you don't have a lot of capacity constraints, this is a perfect technology. What this means is from a user perspective, you see a logo of 5G wherever you go around the country. Now, this doesn't mean you will have the same experience as if you had a dedicated 5G band, but you will see 5G, and if the network is not congested, you will have a pretty good experience. So these are two areas where we think, at least from a deployment perspective, this is how the MNOs are thinking. This is what is going to happen in the next year or 2 years once they launch. Beyond that, it's anybody's guess, but that's the plan as it stands. Then we come to the regulatory perspective. So, of course, from a regulatory perspective, I think we had this discussion. People are concerned about the rural divide, and this is an important issue. So even though you have technologies like DSS as I described, you will, by deploying that DSS, which is use the same spectrum for 4G and 5G, you will get only a 4G-like experience. So you will still have a digital divide. Therefore, we see that regulators are going to push much more strongly for this push to make sure that you roll out 5G in broader and wider areas. We'll share some examples. And of course, this means is that the network economics don't really work as well. So if you were, and this is just one example, if you were to share a network, you would roll out to a lot more places much cheaper than if you had to build it on your own. So I think this part is common, well understood. Therefore, what examples are we seeing of sharing or other kinds of activities in this market? So there's two parts. The y-axis says what's the driver for network sharing? Is it just a commercial agreement, or is there some regulatory force that's saying, well, get going, otherwise I'm coming after you? And we heard the chairman say something along these lines in the previous session, so it's possible. And what sort of approaching entities could come in? One is, of course, your existing agreements, one is new agreements, and then there's entirely new kinds of infracos that are coming in place, and we'll talk a little bit about this. So if we look at the types of agreements, there are already a lot of agreements where, in what we call more mature countries, I guess, I'm not sure about the UK, but definitely Scandinavian countries are a little bit more mature in terms of sharing capability. There are existing 4G agreements that are likely to go into 5G agreements. There are also some examples just through commercial agreements where you see operators going together and saying, okay, let's roll out 5G together. I think Vodafone and the Telecom Italia is a good, interesting example because there's a towerco company called Inwit that is playing a very important role as a neutral party in ensuring the rollout of 5G in new areas. However, there are also some regulatory objectives. So, for example, Korea, there is a mandated sharing rule now. This is what, in some ways, what we heard this afternoon, that you have to, for 5G in certain types of areas, you have to share. Or you can have mandated share, or you can have a coverage obligation saying you better get to 99%, and by the way, I'm going to put a quality of service constraint on this. You can't do this DSS stuff and get away with it. Well, if you're going to get to 99% of the population, it would be crazy not to share. Again, similar with Japan. So these are some ways that the regulator gets involved in this. The regulator can also get involved in new sort of infracos where, and I'll talk the top right-hand side corner, there's a case in Mexico where the regulator said, look, I've got limited spectrum of 700 megahertz. I want a full experience across the country. There's going to be just one telco that provides this. It has its own problems. It's a separate issue and a separate discussion, but you can have the regulator saying that. In the case of 5G, there is also a lot of discussion on whether we should have single netcos, much similar to like we had in the case of fibercos or like NBNco in Australia or in Singapore, for example. So there is a debate on this. And again, it comes primarily from spectrum limitation. So if the spectrum is limited, then the regulators say, let's just have one network or something along those lines. You've then got an interesting example, not only in Peru, in parts of Latin America, where Telefonica and Facebook have come together and said, rural connectivity is important, let's build an open network in rural areas. At the same time, you've got commercially oriented, so Hayal Route, I said, is one example. This is fiber oriented, shared fiber. So here's shared fiber, anyone wants it, it's open access, and it enables you to get to your base station faster and so on. This is not for fiber for the home and so on. This is fiber for enterprise or for backhaul and so on. And we've got an example now of, and I think we talked a little bit about this, where a towerco and a fiber company have got together and they've said, we will build some open access small cells, street furniture that everybody can access. Very early days. The idea is to find some hotspot areas and say, you know what, guys, don't build your own networks here. We'll build something in advance and so on. We haven't seen material numbers here, but you can see the logic of it. If it works, then you go to the next stage. So the new infracos, I think, are the areas that are interesting, because we always thought of infraco as towerco, but we're now finding a lot of different kinds of entities, whether for regulatory reasons or financial reasons, coming in and saying, look, I can help to build the infrastructure in this space. It doesn't stop a towerco, it doesn't say, you know, towercos should do it, but it's just to highlight that these are areas which are coming. So what sort of networks are we seeing? So the first type that we see is wholesale open access active networks. This is exactly the replication of what you have in the fixed world. So in the fixed world, you may have an NBNco. It's a wholesale active open access network. Why would somebody try to do this? Somebody would do this because, for example, spectrum is limited and there is an objective of reducing digital divide. So this is very regulatory driven. So regulator says, look, I don't think that if I give it to you guys, you're going to do the job. I'm going to give it to one guy and then make him really work hard to get to that stage. So that's one kind of access network. There are a lot of problems, and of course there are a lot of good things that come about with this. There are 9 open access active rural networks. So I've deliberately put Facebook there because the moment you put Facebook, everybody gets, oh, why is Facebook in this kind of thing? But there's a telecom operator, there's a financial institution, there's a government, there are multiple entities who are involved in this. But the idea is, again, if we get this money, we'll open up the networks in rural areas because that's where we think the biggest digital divide is. This is partly regulatory, partly commercial. For the MNO, they're saying, well, I'll get a good network which will reside in a wider context, and then I will own that network and earn wholesale revenues from it. They've got open access wholesale fiber networks. So we talked about this, C-squared, higher route, these are examples. The primary focus is metros and intercity, and the logic is you get fiber much faster than you would otherwise get fiber. If you left it to pure commercial decision, then it would take much longer. So what does that mean? These are speculative investments. These are companies that go raise funds, and I think the gentleman in front mentioned that fiber is the new future, and that's exactly the reason why people are investing in this. And it's a way for a new entity to bring funds into the market through a separate vehicle. And the last one is open access small cell networks, which I think is a popular theme. Once we get to that stage, we definitely don't see MNOs are at the stage where they're saying, give me a lot of small cells. And we definitely talk about small cells distinct from distributed antenna systems which are in buildings. But this is not yet out there, although there are a lot of specialist companies that are trying to do different models of this. EDOTCO also has a lot of examples on this. The question, of course, will be how do you pay and so on. But of course, when you need this, it makes much more sense that it is shared than not shared. So just as a quick recap, I think when we talk about infrastructure, we thought it's only towercos, and towercos have been doing a lot just beyond mass. But now we're seeing that different kinds of entities are coming in, fiber companies, specialists in in-building solutions, and so on. The next point is 5G is expected to be the big demand driver for all sorts of infrastructure, probably not in the immediate future. There is going to happen, most of the new 5G deployments are going to be on existing sites. There will be a lot of fancy things happening on the antenna side, and there will be some fancy things happening on the vendor equipment side on dynamic spectrum sharing. The regulators and operators will say, well, if we're going to have to push out more than that, then we're going to have to find a way. The regulators will say, you know, I need to see this happening, otherwise I force sharing, and the network economic will say we're going to have to find ways to share. The approach to shared infrastructure could be through existing agreements, or it could be also new infracos coming and saying, look, here's some infrastructure, no threat, no competition, I'm a neutral party, share my infrastructure. And those infracos will focus on specific constraints. Specific constraints meaning it could be a regulatory constraint, which is I want good coverage nationwide, then you get spectrum and you build an open access network. Or I don't have fiber in the cities, okay, I will build it before anybody else can, and I will address this. Or I've got a small cell problem, and I will do that, build a small cell. So that's it from me. Thank you for your patience.